Hello, and welcome to ONET Academy. This previously recorded webinar is part of the ONET Academy webinar series, a set of online training presentations. This webinar recording, an ONET Academy briefing, how to interpret the ONET Ability Profiler results, will start momentarily.
With that, I want to turn things over to Dr. Janet Wall. Janet?
Gary, thanks an awful lot. And welcome back to those of you that have attended either Monday session or Tuesday session, or perhaps even both. This is the third of a three-part series focusing on the ONET Ability Profiler. On Monday, we talked about just an overview of the tools and focused on the Ability Profiler characteristics. Yesterday, we went into some level of detail on how to administer the Ability Profiler. And then today, we're going to talk about the results that a person gets back if they have taken the Ability Profiler and their bubble answer sheet has been scored and their individual score report has been produced and returned to them. For those of you that have attended all three of the sessions, you can receive a certificate of completion should that be something important for you for your professional development. But if you have not attended the other two sessions, this session will stand on its own, so I make it complete and comprehensive within each of the webinar presentations. The objectives that I have for today are to provide an overview of the Ability Profiler, to describe the contents of the score report, review percentiles, overview how the norms were developed, and how the Ability Profiler results can be matched to occupations, and then review occupational information using ONET Online and to take a look at example profiles that one might return from having your Ability Profiler report generated. So I do want to remind you that there are three instruments that are associated with the ONET system, and that is the Interest Profiler, the Work Importance Profiler or Locator, and the ONET Ability Profiler. As I described in the previous two sessions, the ONET Interest Profiler measures work-related interests, and it comes in paper pencil format and also a computerized format that you can download onto a standalone computer or onto a set of network computers. The same kind of thing occurs for the ONET Work Importance Locator and Profiler. That comes in paper pencil format and also standalone or network version, and it measures what's important on the job or work values. And then the focus of our session today and the previous two sessions has been on the Ability Profiler, which is only a paper pencil instrument, and it measures what an individual can do well or one's abilities, so it's work-related abilities. Just to remind that the results from the Ability Profiler can be used only for career exploration and career counseling, not for job selection or selection into job training programs. It can be administered to a single individual or in groups. And again, just a paper pencil instrument. The Ability Profiler has 11 tests or subtests within the battery, and those are listed here: computation, arithmetic, reasoning, vocabulary, name comparison, object matching, three-dimensional space, and the mark making, place, turn, assemble, and disassemble, which are the 5 psychomotor assessments. And one thing that's important when we take a look at the score report for the Ability Profiler is the person is generally not getting the results on each of the subtests, but they are having reported back to them what is measured. So, and certainly those are linked to the various subtests. So what is measured and what you're going to see on the Ability Profiler score report is a person's results on verbal ability. And as we have said in the previous webinars, it's measured by the vocabulary subtest. Arithmetic reasoning by the arithmetic reasoning subtest. Computation by the computation subtest. Spatial ability by three-dimensional space, form perception by object matching, clerical perception by name comparison, motor coordination by mark making, manual dexterity, which is measured by two of the subtests, one called place and one called turn, and then finger dexterity, which is measured also by two subtests, assemble and disassemble. So again, what you will see on the score report are those things on the left-hand side of this chart. And you can see now the link up between the construct that is measured and the specific subtest from the ability profiler. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind as we're thinking about the score report. Once the person completes the ability profiler and the bubble answer sheet is completed, you would score it. And the scoring is done, can be done in a couple different ways. The primary way, especially if you're working with groups, is to use a scanning process. And you would have a scanner and scanning software, and you would tell the scanning software where to look on the bubble answer sheet and what the proper results should be. That then, once the bubble answer sheet is scanned, it creates an examinee information file, which then interacts with the scoring software, producing the individual score report. And we're going to be taking a look at the various portions of that score report and the kinds of results that are returned. You do have a couple of different options. If you don't want to use the scanning software and scanners, there is a hand data entry program that you can download from onetcenter.org, which would be a reasonable thing to do if you do not have large groups of people taking the ability profiler. And you can also download the scoring program and user guide from that website as well. All right, there's a score report that is generated for every individual who takes the ability profiler. And there's a whole bunch of information on that score report, and we're going to work through the various aspects of it. You can see that the information that a person gets comes in graphic form. So we have the bar graphs on the left-hand side, and also it provides verbal information and numerical information, which you see on the right-hand side. And so what is generated are the person's scores compared to what's called the general working population, or the norm group. And we're going to go over the characteristics of that norm group in a few more slides. But basically you can see that we have verbal ability and verbal ability, arithmetic reasoning and arithmetic reasoning. So we see the full set of areas that are measured in graphic form, and they're also listed in the numerical and narrative form as well. I do want you to note that there is that tracking, that verbal ability, which is first on the graph, is also first in line on the section on the right. And then arithmetic reasoning, which matches up to arithmetic reasoning on the right, computation, and then spatial ability, form perception, clerical perception, motor coordination, finger dexterity, and manual dexterity. So they line up exactly in order. And again, to remind that what is reported are the constructs that are measured, not the subtests. What you get also are the percentiles. So this section in the middle here provides the percentile result of the person who has taken the ability profiler and has received the score report. You can see that that matches up also, that the verbal ability percentile is 27, and that shows up exactly on the bar graph. And 23 matches up to the 23 on the bar graph. So again, that information is tracking. All right, so basically, what is a percentile? Well, this is a screenshot of some data of a fictitious 25-item test. So we have possible scores on the test of 1 through 25. Actually, your possible score could be 0 as well, but we're just going to be working with 1 through 25. What is done with calculating a percentile is we put in a column that indicates how many people got each of those scores. So the person who got 1 correct, there were 2 people. For a raw score of 2, there were 3 people that obtained that. For a raw score of 3, there were 5 people that obtained that. For a raw score of 4, there were 9 people that got that, and so on down the line. So we just keep indicating in this column how many people got each of those scores. So we see for a perfect score, there were no people. Then what we do is we create what's called a cumulative frequency column. And basically what it does is it starts from the raw score of 1 and accumulates, so adds each of these to each other. So we start with a cumulative frequency of 2, and then we add 3 people to that, giving us 5, and then 5 more people giving us 10, and 9 more people giving us 19, and 13 more people giving us 32, and so on down the line. We just keep accumulating until we get to the 500 people that have taken this particular test. Then what happens is we just take that and calculate a percent. So for the raw score of 1, it was 0.4% of individuals who obtained that score. For the raw score of 2, there was 1%. For the raw score of 3, there was 2%. Let's skip over to the raw score of 11, and we see that about 66% of individuals who got a raw score of 11, 66% of those people got a raw score of 11 or below. So this can be then roughly equated to a percentile. So this would be the 66th percentile. So the individual who got a raw score of 11 was in the 66th percentile, meaning that 66% of the people scored as well as or better than or worse than this individual. This individual scored as well as or better than others. All right, so that's generally how a percentile is calculated. This is a kind of a rough description of how it's done, but it just generally gives you the idea of how test makers actually create percentiles. All right, let's take a look at the score report again, and I want to point out a couple other features. On the score report, in addition to the percentile, you get a number correct out of the total number of questions. So this individual, who received a percentile of 27 on verbal ability, answered 10 out of the 19 questions correctly. For arithmetic reasoning, they scored 9 out of 18 questions correctly. Computation, they scored 20 out of 40, and so on down the line. I do want to also point out down here, for finger dexterity and manual dexterity, there is no number correct. It's the number attempted. All right, one other thing that I need to point out is this little superscript here. And that superscript indicates that the percentile scores for these abilities include a deduction for wrong answers. On some tests, as you probably have used, you can obtain a scoring template and just go over the bubble answer sheet and kind of score it yourself. It is because of this penalty for wrong answers that makes the scoring for the ability profiler a little more complex and a little less straightforward. So that's why the scoring program is probably very, very helpful to you, rather than go through the deductions for wrong answers. In some instances, that deduction can be a point. In another instance, it can be a half a point. And in another instance, a quarter of a point. So you really have to work hard at actually scoring the ability profiler, so it's best done by a software program. All right, let's talk a bit about the norms. The norms generated for the ability profiler have come from 4,000 people who were selected to reflect the distributions of workers, the proportions of workers in 5 occupational categories as determined by the U.S. Census Bureau. And these are the categories: professional and semi-professional, clerical, sales, and kindred workers, craftsmen, foremen, and kindred workers, operatives and kindred workers, and laborers, except farm laborers and mine laborers. So basically they were selected from these 5 categories. The norms were developed in the 1950s, but they've done studies since then to show that the means and the standard deviations have been stable over time. And for those of you that want to find out more, there is a report that you can obtain, report number 148 that was developed in 1984, which is, it's really phone book size report that discusses the norms. And I don't believe that this is online. It is something that you might be able to find in your one-stop center or someone who has worked with the GATB. But the sample that was used is called the general working population. The general working population, again, they were selected, those 4,000 people were selected to represent the proportion or percent of people in those occupational groupings that I mentioned. And some of their characteristics include an age range of 18 to 54. They had an average education of 11 years, with females having slightly higher education level than males. This is the gender distribution, slightly more females than males in the sample. But this information has also been supplemented by a number of additional studies that have been subsequently done to include studies on high school students. So for those of you that were in the previous webinars, we noted that I mentioned that you have to be 16 years old or more in order to take the ability profiler. Well, the norm group, as you can see, is 18 to 54. But it's these supplemental studies that allow us to actually go down to the 16-year-old level and allow us to utilize the norms. Again, there is a report. That report that I mentioned, again, will give you far more detail about these norms and how they were created. So the norms were really developed on GATB information, but now we're working with the ability profiler. And as you know, the ability profiler, except for the psychomotor assessments, have all new items. So what had to be done is one had to link the GATB results with the ability profiler results. And this is done typically by an equating study, which has been done by expert individuals in the field of equating. In fact, I've worked with these people before. Siegel and Monzon, they are considered national experts in the field of equating. What they found through their equating studies is that the results between people taking the GATB and those taking the ability profiler were so similar that you could actually utilize the norms for the general working population that I just described. All right, so now back to the score report. We've talked about the kind of information a person gets back in terms of their actual scores. So they get percentiles and they get number correct. But the most important thing that they get from the score report is a set of occupations that match their profile. And so this report begins to describe the kind of information that they're going to get. And what it indicates to them is that they're going to get several sets of occupations and those occupations are going to be organized by job zone. So there's a section on the score report that talks about job zone and what it is. And job zone is basically the amount of education, training, and experience a person needs in order to get into that occupation. And so there's a description. It's how most people get into the job, how much overall experience people need, how much education they need, how much on-the-job training that they need. And they're basically asked to think about what job zone is most pertinent to them. So a current job zone is one that they would have the amount of education, training, and experience currently, and then one that they might aspire to in the future. And there's a description of job zones. Job zone 1, requiring little or no preparation, and a job zone 2 with some, a job zone 3, medium preparation, job zone 4, considerable preparation, and job zone 5, extensive preparation. So again, they're asked to think about current job zone, where am I now, and a future job zone, where would I like to be in terms of my education, training, and experience. And what the report does, and the scoring program does, is it actually generates 5 lists of occupations for the person, one for each job zone. So for that profile that we looked at, this is the set of occupations that the person would get for job zone 1 occupation. So you can see textile bleaching and dyeing, meter readers, child care workers, food cooking machine operators and tenders, and so on down the line. They also get a listing of job zone 2 occupations, order fillers, wholesale and retail sales, feeders, metal and plastic, freight inspectors, fire inspectors, boiler operators and tenders, sales representatives, job zone 3, and I hope you can see that with these occupations, the requirements tend to be increasing. Advertising sales agent, talent directors, immigration and customs inspectors, sales representatives for medical. Job zone 4, art directors, technical directors and managers, poets and lyricists, copywriters. And job zone 5, clergy, health educators, archivists, political scientists, sales engineers, directors of religious activities and education, technical writers, counseling psychologists. All right, so the person gets 5 groupings of occupations. Now, one question would be, well, how can they do that? How can they, with the person's scores that you saw, how can they actually give 5 different sets of occupations? Well, what actually happens is that a person's profile is matched up to the profile of an occupation. So we saw the person's profile on that score report. We saw the bar graph. Think of that bar graph and the shape of that bar graph across all of those 9 areas that were measured. GWell has produced the same kind of profile for occupations. And it's been an evolutionary process because the ONET occupations are evolutionary. But basically they started out with developing occupational ability profiles for each of the 950 original ONET occupations. If you go to onetcenter.org, you can download several technical reports that describe how this was done. And it's, again, a very complex process. And those reports would, for those of you that want to rub around in the details, those reports would provide that information to you. They did this by using ability scores of actual job incumbents in more than 1,000 jobs, along with the original information from the Dictionary of Occupational Titles to include data, people, and things, and specific vocational preparation, and using that kind of information. So we're using VOT information, we're using ability scores of job incumbents in the occupation. They were able to estimate ability scores for the occupations within the ONET system. And then, as part of the evolutionary process, the original 950 ONET occupations are being converted to SOC classification. So there's been a further compiling of information and congealing of information to the current roughly 800 plus ONET SOC occupations. So again, for more detail on that, those technical reports would be very helpful. All right, so let me say again that what happens in order to generate those 5 listings is the program compares the shape of the person's profile on the ability profiler with the occupational profile. If you can think of kind of overlaying the shape of the person's profile onto the occupational profile, and it's matching the shape, not the level of the score. It's the shape of the profile. And they use what they call an index of similarity. It's really a correlation, correlating shape. And where there is a strong correlation between the person's profile and the occupational profile, that occupation is included in the person's list of potential occupations. So it's the shape of the profile that matters, not the level or the percentile. So as you can see, the person whose profile we've been looking at was given occupations that require fairly extensive education, training, and experience. So you would anticipate that some of those occupations would have very high verbal ability, computation, and so on. But that's not what they're doing. They're not comparing percentile scores to ability requirements. They're comparing the shape of occupations to the shape of the occupational profile to the shape of the person's profile. All right. The scoring program, what that does is it provides a minimum of 10 occupations for each job zone for the person. If there are very strong matches, they get up to 25. And the degree of the correlation depends upon the number of ability profiler subtests that were taken. Now, you can actually, if you don't like this kind of setup, it's my understanding that you can go back into the scoring program and actually change it so that you're getting perhaps more occupations than 25 or something less than that. So you can change that criterion should you wish to. All right, so let me pause for a minute or so. I have a couple questions that come in, and we're going to talk about now how to use those results for exploring an occupation. So Jamie asked, once the matches are delineated, is there any link to determine the physical demands of said positions? Well, we're kind of going to cover that, Jamie, when we talk about going into ONET Online, which would have that kind of information. So I think my question, or your question, will be answered by the end of the webinar. And there's a question, does the ONET database allow you to look up the occupational ability profile for the occupations listed in the database without taking the ability profiler? I believe the answer to that is no, but it's something that I think I should double check. I am not aware of any place where you can do that. But I will double check, and if you want to email me with that question again, and I will attempt to find the absolute answer for that. My email is sagesolutions, S-A-G-E, solutions, at earthlink.net. And what I'll do is I'll go back to the URL people and just make sure that I'm giving you the correct answer on that. All right, so what happens is the person then takes a look at their 5 listings. And they've selected, hopefully, a current job zone and a future job zone, or they don't have to do that at all. They can just select any job zone that they feel like they want to look at. They can examine all of them. And this is, okay, let me pause a minute again for a question that has just popped in from Catherine. Why is the cutoff age for these tests 53? I'm not really sure it is a cutoff of 53. The only requirement in terms of age that I'm aware of is the age of 16. You have to be 16 years old or older in order to get reasonable scores or valid scores from the ability profiler. All right, so the person has taken a look at the 5 listings of occupations, and they've selected a few occupations to explore further. 1 is from Job Zone 1, and 2 are from Job Zone 3. But they could look at all of the occupations that come on their list, or 1 from each of the job zones, up to them. This is now the point where they're actually doing career exploration. And this is what I like about the way this is handled, because this is truly more career exploration than you find in other programs. You're actually given kind of the full view, a full range of education, training, and experience options to take a look at. So it might actually encourage people, if they don't like the occupations that are on their list for their current situation, they can see what kinds of occupations are out there if they obtain further education and training. So we would take a look at a particular occupation. And we're going to take a look at fire inspectors at Job Zone 3. And we would do that by going to ONET Online at that URL. It's online.onetcenter.org. And we would go to Find Occupations. And we would click on Find Occupations. And we would want to do a quick search. But as you can see, we can browse by job family or high growth industry or STEM discipline or by ONET descriptor. But for purposes of this particular exercise, we're going to just put in keyword fire inspector. We would click on Go. And up will come a listing of several occupations. Fire inspectors happen to be at the top of the list, and that's the occupation that this person is interested in. So we would click on that occupation, and we would come up with a summary report, which includes the vast variety of information that one finds in the ONET system. We would see a short description of that occupation, a sample of reported job titles, so other job titles that might be used by people in say, want ads or in job descriptions. But the most important thing would be to see the variety of information that's available on the summary report, to include tasks, knowledge, skills, abilities, work activities, work context, job zone, interests, work styles, work values, related occupations, and wages and employment. So we can see from here the tasks for fire inspectors are listed. And this is just a partial listing on the screenshot. There are more tasks involved. Knowledge. So fire inspectors need knowledge of public safety and security, building and construction, customer and personal service, and so on. Skills. They need the skills of active listening, reading comprehension, time management, writing, and critical thinking, speaking, and so on. They need abilities. The abilities is a partial list here. Problem sensitivity, oral comprehension, oral expression, inductive reasoning, and rear vision. Work activities, so we need to do things like getting information, inspecting equipment, structures, or material, performing for or working directly with the public, documenting, recording information, and you can see the rest of the list. Work context, they need to deal with external customers, they have contact with others, they're in an enclosed vehicle or equipment, and this again is a partial list. The interest areas, and here's where you can match it up to the interest profile results or any other interest inventory that works off of the Holland vocational personality theory. Work styles, so we see integrity, dependability, attention to detail, cooperation. Work values, achievement and support, and related occupations. And if a person decides after looking at the summary report information that that's not an occupation to them, but something similar would be appropriate, they can take a look at these related occupations. I do want to point out that there's an in-demand logo that you see for some of these occupations. These are the high-growth, in-demand occupations that are being emphasized as part of the ONET system. So these are, again, in-demand occupations, fast-growing, largest employment, important to Homeland Security and to the economy of the U.S. I'd also want to show you, we saw a sample report where the scores were pretty low, but that can be different if you score higher on the ability profiler results. So here we have a person, Joe Lewis, who has obtained higher scores than that previous example. And again, you can see, imagine the shape of the profile. Imagine taking the midpoint of each of these bars and drawing a line between each of the bars, and you get a shape that is created. And it's that kind of shape of the person that is matched up to the shape of the occupation, the occupational requirements. All right, and I have a couple more things to say, but let's address a couple of questions that come in. All right. Jamie, again, your question. Once the matches are delineated, is there any link to determine the physical demands of said positions? And again, you would go to ONET Online and take a look at the physical demands of that occupation. So knowledge, facts, skills, and abilities, and so on. So that kind of information is there. You can also search by descriptor. If you go to ONET Online, you would be able to actually browse by ONET descriptor, and I believe it's either under skills or abilities, where the physical demands are part of that information. So I would suggest that you give that a try and see if that kind of approach is something that's workable for you. I have a question from Larry. Has any longitudinal testing been done to confirm the validity of using the shape of the graph to predict future job zones? Some of the constructs, dexterity, are probably stable, while others may or may not be amenable to education and training. So would a person's profile shape stay the same over time? Well, hopefully not, especially with the non-psychomotor assessments, where you can improve your computation skills. You can improve your vocabulary with additional education and training. And so if you did that and then retook the ability profiler, you probably, hopefully, would get higher scores in those categories. So I don't think that the person's shape would necessarily stay the same if they got additional education and training in some of those educable areas. I think probably for the dexterity tests, I'm not sure if those would be stable over time or not. I would think that if you would practice those things enough times, you would improve your scores. But perhaps at some point in time, I'm going to predict that as you get older, you probably would slow down a little bit in those areas. Answering a different part of your question, I don't think there are studies that attempt to predict future job zones. I don't think that's the purpose of the assessment, is to predict future job zones. What they're doing is coming up with listings of occupations based on those occupational ability profiles that have been created. And Larry, what I would encourage you to do is to go to onetcenter.org and pull down those technical reports to see how those things have been created. Okay, and then from John, it seems that you've been careful to use the term ability rather than aptitude. Do you recommend doing the same? What's the predictive value of an ability score if the percentile rank is ignored? Predictive value of an ability score. Maybe those are two different questions. I have been careful to use the word ability rather than aptitude because we're talking with the ability profile of work-related abilities. And we're not talking, I think sometimes people think of the concept of aptitude as something being more innate, more like an IQ. So we try to use the word ability, which is something a person can actually change with education and training that has been provided. What's the predictive value of an ability score if the percentile rank is ignored? Well, considering that's a separate question from the first one that you asked, John, we're really not trying to predict anything here from the percentile rank. So that's why that's not emphasized. And really that's why you don't use the ability profiler to do job selection kinds of things or selection into job training programs. That's not the purpose of the assessment. The purpose of the assessment is to give a person some understanding of their relative abilities in the areas that have been measured and to see occupations that are kind of compatible with that and compatible via the shape rather than the degree of their percentiles. Okay, and from John, another John here, who determined the demand? That's a whole other issue. If you take a look at what people are focusing on in terms of the in-demand occupations and industries, these have been determined largely by employers and the Department of Labor, who have taken a look at which occupations are growing rapidly and that have the largest employment and that have been determined to be important to employers and the U.S. economy and also Homeland Security. So my suggestion to find out a little bit more would be to go to careervoyages.com and take a look at that website. It's based on ONET information. That entire website is, ONET is the foundation for all this, but we are now focusing, because of the President's job initiative, we're focusing on in-demand occupations largely, and Career Voyages is a website basically focused on those occupations only. And then I have a comment from Robert Massanova, and he's saying the National Occupational Outlook Handbook is also a good source for additional career information, and that's absolutely true. You can get the Occupational Outlook Handbook online, or you can actually obtain a paper copy as well. I believe one has to purchase the paper copies, but ONET Online is clearly free. And are there any other questions that you have? And you can come in verbally with these questions as well by unmuting your phone. Okay, Jamie, why don't you send, Jamie is indicating that the physical demand information can't be found. Jamie, email me your email address, and I will indicate to you how we can find that information. And a comment or a question from John, would you call the ability profiler an achievement test rather than an aptitude test? Again, I discussed the term aptitude, which sometimes is thought of as something measuring innate abilities, and we are focusing on things that are, as you saw, the kinds of things that are measured are things like verbal ability and arithmetic ability, things that are classroom-oriented and can be influenced by getting some additional training. And then you also have those things that are three-dimensional space, for example, and object matching and name comparison, and probably some training influence could be present there as well. I'm not sure I would call it an achievement test. I would call it an ability profiler. Okay, and again, a comment from Jamie. Again, Jamie, why don't you email me, and I will indicate to you how you can find that information that you're looking for on physical demand. Other questions? Okay, I do want to, as you can see, and especially for those of you that have been in the 3 webinars with me, that the ability profiler is really a fairly complex instrument, and there are a whole lot of aspects to it that I was not able to cover in the short period of time we've been together. So we actually created some additional support materials, like a self-assessment quiz, like a Lunch and Learn training package, which can be downloaded from onetacademy.com. And I would suggest going to onetcenter.org, where you can actually download the variety of reports and manuals and technical reports that are supporting the use of all 3 of the assessment instruments, but for today's purposes, the ability profiler, and check out how these various things have been done in much more detail than I've been able to provide. And also you can check out supporting webinars that we've done, again on the ability profiler, but also on ONET for job seekers and students, school counselors, military and transition, links between occupations, education, and pay, the data collection aspects of ONET and the ONET system. So those can be helpful as well. And so if there are no other questions, I thank you very much for being with me. Oh, here we go. Another question has come in. Where can we purchase the ONET Ability Profiler? As I have said in previous webinars, that you can do, there are several things that you can do, and all this is specified in detail on onetcenter.org in the Career Exploration Tools section. But basically, you can actually download files that you can print out on your computer, on your desktop computer. You can download print files, which are higher resolution files, and you can take those to your agency, your print shop in your agency, or to someplace like Kinko's and get the Ability Profiler professionally printed. Or you can go to the government printing office and actually purchase the materials. And onetcenter.org will have the cost information available to you if you go with the government printing office solution. The other ways are free, except for the fact that if you print multiple copies, you are best served by going to the print shop because of the higher resolution files. The print shop will, if you go to someplace like Kinko's, they will charge. Perhaps your agency print shop will not charge you. I'm not sure. That would be a policy of your own agency. But for actually administering the Ability Profiler, it is very important for standardization purposes and fairness purposes that the end product is in excellent resolution and people can actually see them. If you've taken a look at some of the subtests on the Ability Profiler, such as name comparison and object matching and three-dimensional space, you need to see the details very clearly in order to be able to answer the questions. So those higher resolution files are critically important. Are there any other questions?
Janet, I actually saw a few questions come in about how participants are going to receive the attendance certificate.
All right.
Look for that to come. Look for that to come before close of business Friday or before Friday. I'll just need to go through and see what participants attended all 3 sessions. So, like I said, look for that to come before close of business Friday. It'll be email, sent via email.
Okay. Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm about to see you at future webinars. Yes.
I do have a question.
Okay.
It has to do with the WIA program. Do you know what I'm talking about, the Workforce Investment Act?
Yeah, to some extent.
Okay, and the reason I asked the question about who determined the demand has to do with the WIA program, because there is a demand list or demand occupation list that you used the same name for that is built, that is part of that program, and I'm just wondering how closely that demand occupation list follows your demand on ONET, follows the WIA demand occupation list.
Well, I don't know specifically the answer to that. One would hope that they would be awfully similar.
Because I'm not, some of the ones that you showed on there do not show on my demand occupation list within the WIA program.
Okay. Well, I don't know how to rectify that particular situation, but if you want to see the in-demand occupations, one would go to Career Voyages, and you can obtain all that occupational information there. And they focus a lot on the industry level as well. So, again, these are the occupations that have been determined nationally to be those that are important. And it depends on how people define in-demand. On Career Voyages, how they are defining it would be those that are fastest growing, those that have the largest employment, those that are important to national security, those that are important to the U.S. economy. And again, a lot of that is determined by employers and also other information in terms of the growth of that occupation.
Right, and I think
Bureau of Labor statistics.
Yeah, and I
information would come into play.
And I think within the WIA program, it actually goes down even further, which it looks at regions within certain areas, which is demand. Because, and again, I'm not, a forest ranger may not be a demand occupation in, West Texas, because they don't have any trees out there anyway, or, but it might be one in East Texas, which is, again, it's not, I understand. I'm just trying to figure out how to determine whether or not it's the same or not.
Yeah. Well, let me recommend, is the WIA information regional or is it national?
Well, WIA is national. I mean, that is a program that comes out of the Department of Labor.
Right, but the occupation list that you're looking at, is that regional or national?
See, and I'm thinking that is regional, because the way we spend our money is determined by within our particular area or WDA. I'm almost positive it's regional. So,
okay, well, let me see if this particular suggestion can give you more information on the issue. If you go to America's Career Infonet, which is acinet.org,
right.
You can actually, there's a section on there where you can find occupational information.
Right.
And you can actually find things like the fastest growing, largest employment, fastest declining, and you can also do a lot of that at the, I don't think it's regional level, but I think it's state level.
Okay, what was that again? What was that website?
It's acinet.
acinet.org. Okay, .org. Okay.
Yeah, and there's some tools there, and I actually have a webinar that goes through all those tools.
Okay.
So that might be at least additional information.
Dr. Wall?
Thank you.
Yes.
Dr. Wall, this is Gene Bouchard for Robert Massanova. I'm calling from the New Jersey Department of Labor and Workforce Development. Yes, we're familiar with the Workforce Investment Act, and it's administered by bureaus, workforce investment bureaus here in the state of New Jersey. and they operate in all the various 21 counties. And what they do is, and what we do is, we determine demand in each one of those counties, so that if carpenter is in demand in, let's say, a Burlington County here in New Jersey, it may not be in demand in Mercer County. So we have check marks. We can finitely do it for each county in New Jersey. Okay, does that help?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Very good.
I suspect other states are doing the very same.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're doing the very same. Yeah. All right?
Well, that's a good exchange. Thanks for your comments.
You're surely welcome.
Okay, anything else before we sign off?
Yes, this question, or I should say statement, is really directed to Gary. This is Grace Guerrero from New York State Department of Labor on Long Island. And the information about our WIA does go very locally in terms of demand. So we can pinpoint on what is really in demand on Long Island as opposed to what might be in demand in New York City or someplace upstate New York. But getting back to Gary, in the beginning you talked about us clicking into the little chat information. I could not. It did not work on my things. I just want to let you know I'm here, and I think the presentation was great. And I'm going to scout out how to get back and get the first one, since I joined yesterday's and today, and unfortunately I got in too late Monday for the first one, and I will look forward to that. And I hope this is done again, because I'd like to get some of our staff involved in this too.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wall.
And thank you for the info.
All right. Hearing no questions and seeing no further questions coming in via chat, I want to thank you very much for your participation, and look forward to having you in future webinars. Have a great day, people.
This concludes today's session. I'd like to thank Dr. Wall for her time, and for you, the participants, for joining us. Have a good day.